Welcome back to Dharma Review, everyone. This is part 2 of our continuing series in a response to the millennial cry for help and a general response to the state of our union. Okay, so where were we? Oh, yes. We had started talking about an article that was published through Huffington Post, and it was an interactive work about the condition that we find ourselves in and the frustration that our youth from the millennials forward who are having such a hard time. And I brought out in part 1 of this about how they are not the only ones frustrated. A lot of us are frustrated. Many of us are frustrated. Many of us see a lot of things going on that we wish could be different. So, we discovered in the last episode that there was a lot that had changed in our country by the time the baby boomers were born, between the time the baby boomers were born and grew up and the time that millennials and Generation Xers and Yers were born and grew up. Primarily, of course, the biggest thing was a big jump in population growth. Then, of course, there's the continued growth and development of the tech sector, and with it, regrouping of population around those cities that became centers for this new industry. I am, of course, speaking about chip makers and software companies and hardware developers of computer components. The personal computer revolution was just beginning. At that time, I was a psych major at the University of Houston with a second major in Middle East history. But I could see what was looming on the horizon. Nothing less than a complete technical revolution. Big changes lie ahead. Yes, I was a baby boomer. I'm a baby boomer, and a late bloomer at that. I spent what should have been my college years traveling through Europe and the Middle East. And when I got back to the U.S., I went into business. It was 9 years later before I enrolled in college. I wasn't the only one. There were even older people than myself doing this. I had just turned 30, but my compatriots were like 40-somethings, 50-somethings, or even older. Some were women who never had the chance to go to college, and even elderly folk who never had the time or the money until they retired. Universities coined a new phrase for us: non-traditional student. That explained us. The term caught on. Yes, all of a sudden there was new excitement in the air. If you embraced change and challenge, the future was starting to look much brighter. The year was 1985. I say starting because just before all this technical breakthrough that was happening, we had just come through very, very tough times. The oil crisis of 1979 put a world of hurt on a lot of people, especially in Houston, Texas initially. Many small businesses went under. Houston's economy in those days was primarily based on the oil industry and energy industry, and many small businesses grew up around this horn of plenty. The arts were thriving too as a result. Thousands of wildcatters at this time went belly up. They took restaurants, office supply companies, office buildings, art galleries, and entertainment companies with them. It was brutal. So there was a lot of talk about artificial intelligence already in 1985. A new day was dawning full of promise. Artificial intelligence was being talked about. Robotics were being talked about. IBM was showcasing their hot new modular tower computer and trying to sell the students on its configurability and usefulness. Toshiba was premiering their very first laptop computer on The Late Show with Johnny Carson. And DOS 2.0 was the operating system. Microsoft was already experimenting with Windows 1.0. Wow. You cannot imagine the thrill Windows pains. created. Nothing more than rectangles drawn on a page, separating text elements that could be stacked just like papers on a desktop, layered on your screen on top of each other. Imagine that, just like a desk. Sounds so archaic. Yeah, really, it was then too. I eagerly awaited 1.1, which let me load it on my $1,500 Toshiba T1100 laptop, which I purchased with some student loan money from the brand new campus computer store. I still remembered a group of us gathering around my little quarter-sized, I should say, amber screen when I first booted it up. "That's it?" cried one student loudly, and all began laughing. "Not ready for prime time," said another. "Waste of time," chimed in a classmate. "Yeah, I guess I'll just stick with my DOS screen. Not enough memory to really do anything with it anyway," I said. Regardless, at least I had 2 new micro floppy drives and 656K of onboard RAM. An LCD screen, albeit monochrome, but it weighed nothing compared to the lunchbox computers like Osborne and Compaq. Hell, my keyboard was attached all in one unit. This was the future, I thought. Wish I had another $1,000 so I could have one of those new hard drives. A 10-megabyte hard drive at that time was $800. There was no internal hard drive option on the T1100. So you used one of the floppies to run your program and the other to save your files. Everyone thought that the new micro discs were so cool, though. I entered college on the cutting edge. I could see the future fast approaching on the horizon. I was bound to become the first shrink catering to AI entities. Ha! I even wrote a thesis and did a presentation where I illustrated how soon we would all be interfacing with artificial intelligence and neural networks, and how it was going to radically change our world. And then, quietly to myself, I hypothesized that certainly these boxed intelligences would most definitely have psychological problems, being relegated to living isolated lives housed in metal containers. And so certainly there would have to be shrinks dedicated to their well-being. I can laugh about it now. We were decades away from serious autonomous and potentially conscious machines. Consumerism took the forefront of the technological revolution as we moved from 4-year life cycles to 1-year life cycles to where we are now. 30-plus years have passed. So engrossed and mesmerized by all of this, we were too busy to keep close watch on our elected officials. While we were all held captivated by these amazing innovations of science and technology and the promise of how much good this would bring to our world, and while we were busy exploring the capabilities of this new thing called the Internet with our professors who were so excited about it, and while we worked our asses off to acquire all this new, more powerful wizardry for our pleasure, with promises of how much better our lives would all become. The excitement of how we would all have so much more time for the most important things in life was literally intoxicating. And while we were busy dreaming of the amazing possibilities this new free form of open communication was going to bring and how much good it was going to bring the world, our democracy was being whittled away beneath our very feet. And now we find ourselves in this precarious situation with our democracy being held hostage, with personal progress being stymied and societal gains being thrown back to the 60s, and even worse. We are watching before our eyes not subtle, but blatant gaslighting, scapegoating, and the curtailing of freedoms of the press. So how do we fix this? How do we fix this? How do we turn this train wreck around? Well, first, we have to understand how this all came about. That's the first step. When you have been plunged into darkness, you first have to find the light switch. Stumbling around in the dark just won't do. There's too many things to bump into, bang your knee on, and fall over. I hope to at least give you a good flashlight so that you can start to find your way to the fuse box. Replace that blown-out fuse and restore your lighthouse before any more ships run aground. So these terms I'm going to be discussing with you right now have been thrown around by the media lately quite a lot. And one of them is gaslighting. So what is gaslighting? Well, gaslighting is a form of manipulation that seeks to sow seeds of doubt in a targeted individual or members of a targeted group, hoping to make them question their own memory, perception, and sanity. Using persistent denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying, it attempts to destabilize the target and delegitimize the target's belief. Instances may range from the denial of an abuser that previous abuse have happened or even ever occurred, to the staging of bizarre events by the abuser with the intention of disorienting the victim. The term owes its origin to the 1938 Patrick Hamilton play by the name Gaslight, and its 1940 and then later 1944 film adaptations. The term has been used today in clinical research literature as well as in political commentary. There are some great links that you can look up for yourself. Simply do a search on these terms I'm telling you about, and you'll find them. Wikipedia also is a great resource. So now let's talk about scapegoating. What is scapegoating? Well, actually, scapegoating comes from a biblical story, placing the sins of the people onto a goat. This is an ancient Hebraic story. Onto a goat and sending it into the wilderness. But today it's defined as someone who blames others for their own transgression and then also blames them for all the problems that others experience, thus taking focus off the real perpetrator. It also involves dehumanizing the person or the group and then persecuting them, usually those who are incapable of defending themselves. The key here, of course, is taking the focus off the real perpetrator. And who's the real perpetrator? The one doing the finger pointing and the tongue wagging, of course. It's the classic pot calling the kettle black. Then there's disinformation campaigns. This brings us to the current situation that we find ourselves in. The underhanded use of blatant disinformation campaigns. Not that disinformation campaigns are anything in themselves new. In fact, American and Allied troops perpetrated one of the most successful campaigns in history to fool the Nazi troops into focusing their efforts far afield from the real movements of tanks and troops in order to gain the element of surprise in World War II. I'll post a link where you can look these things up for yourself. There was a recent documentary about it that you can find at history.com. Propaganda, defined by Wikipedia this way: information that is not objective and is used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, to encourage a particular synthesis or perception, or using loaded language to produce an emotional rather than a rational response. So loaded language is creating a phrase and then repeating it over and over to elicit an emotional response again and again and again, something that everyone becomes identified with that brings up this emotion. Loaded language. Then, of course, there's the cult of personality. again defined by Wikipedia this way. A cult of personality arises when a country's regime, or more rarely, an individual politician, uses the techniques of mass media, propaganda, the big lie, spectacle, the arts, patriotism, and government-organized demonstrations and rallies to create an idealized, heroic, and worshipful image of a leader, often through unquestioning flattery and praise. Any one of these tools alone could be used by adept hands to serious detriment. But in the last 2 years, it becomes obvious to any astute observer that not one, not two, but all of them have been deployed. All one has to do is review the video records of the past presidential campaign to start picking out instances of these very same techniques. But we can also go back years and review the birther campaign in an attempt to discredit our most recent past president and the effort to convince the public that he wasn't even an American. Once your eyes have been opened to these things, I'm afraid you won't be able to close them again. Or worse, when you try to close them and get some rest from all the insanity swirling around us, the light will shine even through your closed eyelids. I'm sorry if this is painful for some of you, but it's necessary to save our lives. Nothing less is at stake. It's like going to your doctor for your annual physical only to be told that you have something seriously wrong and you need emergency surgery. It's a shock, I know. But what's the alternative? Some will tell you, but wait. All we have to do is meditate more, pray harder, think good thoughts, and the world will right itself, won't it? Okay, let me ask you, how did that work out for the Tibetans? Or for that matter, for Britain just prior to World War II? And more recently, how has not acting worked out for our recent school incursions? Doing nothing is never a solution, and in fact, it never has been. For all my yogic friends out there, let me take you to some place that you might relate to. Let me take you back to an ancient situation that you love to cite when talking about yoga and Krishna, to that famous battle in the Bhagavad Gita itself, the Battle of Kurukshetra in the fields of Kuru. It's so convenient to forget or to leave out of the retelling of the Gita what the situation was that led to Arjuna's journey of enlightenment. Was it not indeed facing the hard, cold facts of the situation in simple and certain terms? Let me read it to you now, if I may. This is the Gita. Krishna is speaking to Arjuna. Not by avoiding actions does a man gain freedom from action, and not by renunciation alone can he reach the goal. No one, not even for an instant, can exist without acting. All beings are compelled, however unwilling, by the three strands of nature called gunas. He who controls his actions but lets his mind dwell on sense objects is deluding himself and spoiling his search for the deepest truth. The superior man is he whose mind can control his senses. With no attachment to results, he engages in the yoga of action. Do any action you must do, since action is better than inaction. even the existence of your body depends on necessary actions. I'm just briefly reminded of the Battle of Jericho and the ancient Israelites when they marched against a fortified enemy of their time. They raised a ruckus with one singular voice. All together they marched and didn't stop yelling and stomping until the walls fell down. There is plenty of precedence and proof text to dispel any notion of inaction when it comes to interacting with the world when injustice, danger, or war enters into one's sphere of existence. The highest yogis were both engaging and engaged. Let me give an example. When crops were failing, Shirdi Sai intervened to assist the villagers. When a child fell down a well, Shirdi Sai did not say, "Wait on the Lord and pray." No, rather he himself went to the well and rescued the child. Buddha himself challenged a coup attempt in the court of his king, including speaking up to discredit conspirators in his midst. This when one of his own prized disciples lost his moral bearings. And in another time, Buddha stood in protest in front of a king's castle because a king was not taking care of his people. He taught in many courts around the land about the responsibility that royalty had to share their wealth and take care of their subjects. Oh, yes. But let me go back to the Bhagavad Gita for a moment. I just love it. I think it is so relevant for today. Why? Precisely because the story starts with Arjuna shrunk from battle. Because he knows these people in the opposing armies, they are his kinsmen, his very relatives, and his teachers even. One reason we are in this predicament today, I believe, is because of the same kind of concerns and fears. And I will do some more talking about this in coming episodes. Getting back to the spiritual roots of this podcast. But for now, Arjuna's charioteer is revealing himself as the Almighty Lord himself and tells Arjuna, "In all three worlds, Arjuna, there is nothing I need do. Nothing I must attain, and yet I engage in action. For if I were to refrain from my tireless, continual action, mankind would follow my example and would also not act, Arjuna. If I stopped acting, these worlds would plunge into ruin. Chaos would overpower all beings. Mankind would be destroyed." The Lord goes on to say what the purpose of action should be. Though the unwise cling to their actions, watching for results, the wise are free of attachments and act for the well-being of the whole world. So yes, I will agree with any yoga teacher who says we are not to be attached to our actions. It isn't ours to say, "Look what I did, aren't I great?" However, to say that we do nothing or should do nothing is a perversion of the true teaching. Or at the very least, it's a misinterpretation of the true teaching. In other words, we are not to refuse to act because we say to ourselves, "What good will it do? And besides, what can one person do to make a difference?" In fact, we are told that if we act with the right intention, we will inspire others to also act. I'm quoting today from the Bhagavad Gita, a new translation by Stephen Mitchell. I find it to be by far the most approachable and easily read of the translations for the 21st century Westerner to absorb. The poetry is kept intact by his adept use of the English language and his understanding of the original language and context. For those purists among us who want to read and let the original speak unfettered to our minds and our hearts without other commentary, I find it absolutely enlivened with divine energy. Of course, you have to be so inclined. If you have never read the Bhagavad Gita, I highly recommend this translation, and I would love to hear from you as to how you personally found it to be. There is something to be said for looking at original text, especially classical writings and ancient writings unadorned, and then seeing how you feel about them without someone superimposing their beliefs on top of the original. We live in a very privileged age right now, with enormous resources of accrued learning and research by linguists, cultural and historical experts, archaeologists, and we have amazing libraries preserved for posterity thanks to the efforts of dedicated universities around the globe. This age of ours, thanks to computers and the internet, affords us great opportunities to access these treasure troves of learning and wisdom. But with all this access also comes great responsibility. Because also, for everyone out there who wants to share factual, historical information, there also lives out there a world of people who want to convince, manipulate, and control what you think, and to keep you misinformed and imprisoned in ignorance. I wish it were not so. But sadly, it is true. And another thing, sadly that is true, is that of those spiritual seekers out there who may be young or inexperienced, our tendency is to be more easily manipulated. Why? Well, it's simple. Because in order to experience that which we call spiritual, it does require a willing suspension of disbelief. Or at least, that is what we're often told. Certainly, it requires a willingness to experiment with probabilities. And that is why throughout the ages we have been guided by those with experience and wisdom. They, however, cannot force us to listen or to take their advice. They can only point the way. In upcoming episodes, we are going to take a look together at some of these pointings. It will be up to you to do with it what you will. I hope this has helped you a little bit in these difficult times. I hope that you, like me, can take some encouragement from the recent actions of our brave students around our country who are acting, setting an example of plain talk, demanding truth and real action be taken by those elected to represent us. Their message is clear. You will be judged by your actions, not just your words. We would all do well to take that to heart. Until next time, this is Dharma Review.